The old church stood at the heart of the small village, its spire piercing the heavens like an accusatory finger. For centuries, it had been a sanctuary for the devout and a landmark for weary travelers. Its stone facade bore the weathered marks of time, etched with stories that no one alive could recall. On most days, the church lay in tranquil silence, its solitude broken only by the occasional echo of footsteps across its hollow wooden floors. But one fateful evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched long across the earth, the silence was shattered by a bell that no one remembered installing. The bell rang once, a low, mournful tone that seemed to reverberate through the very marrow of the villagers' bones. It wasn't the familiar chime of the church's time-worn bells, which marked the passing hours and summoned the faithful to prayer. This was different, deeper, darker, and almost alive. It seemed to roll through the air like a wave, leaving an unsettling chill in its wake. At first, the villagers thought it was their imagination. But when the second toll came, louder and more resonant, they turned their heads toward the church with a collective unease. Father Elias, the church's caretaker and priest, had no explanation. He had been tending to the altar when the sound first erupted, and the vibration had shaken the chalice in his hand. His first instinct was to blame the old mechanisms of the bell tower. Perhaps the ropes had shifted, or the wind had found its way through the rafters. Yet, when he climbed the creaking ladder to inspect the bell tower, he found nothing out of place. The great bronze bells hung still and silent, as they had since the previous service. The mysterious toll was not from them. Word of the phantom bell spread quickly. By morning, the villagers were gathering outside the church, speculating about its origin. Some claimed it was an omen, a warning from God, or perhaps a punishment. Others dismissed it as a trick of the wind or the echo of thunder. But as the days passed and the bell continued to toll at random intervals, always at twilight, doubt began to give way to fear. No one could say for certain where the sound came from, and no one could explain why it made their hearts race and their skin crawl. The mystery deepened when Mrs. Abernathy, the village's oldest resident, claimed she had heard the bell before. Her voice, quivering with age and trepidation, carried a weight of authority that silenced the doubters. "I was a girl," she whispered, "no older than 10. It rang then too, out of nowhere. The elders said it was a curse, a bell that called for something lost." She refused to elaborate, her wrinkled hands trembling as she clutched her rosary. The look in her eyes was enough to convince even the most skeptical. Father Elias, determined to maintain order, announced that he would hold a special evening mass to pray for guidance and protection. The villagers reluctantly agreed, though many admitted to feeling a sense of dread about stepping foot inside the church after dark. On the night of the mass, the pews were filled with anxious faces. Candles flickered against the high stone walls, casting long shadows that seemed to dance and writhe like living things. As Father Elias began his sermon, his voice steady despite the unease gripping his own heart, the bell tolled again. This time, the sound was deafening, shaking the very foundations of the church. Candles extinguished in an instant, plunging the congregation into darkness. The silence that followed was so profound that even the faintest breath seemed thunderous. When the lights were restored, something was different. At the back of the church, just beneath the stained glass window of St. Michael, stood a new addition. It was an iron bell, smaller than the church's main bells but equally imposing. No one had seen it brought in, and no one could explain how it had appeared. Its surface was etched with strange symbols that none could recognize, and its clapper was stained a dark, rust-colored red. Father Elias approached the bell cautiously, his heart pounding. The air around it felt heavy, oppressive, as though the very atmosphere was resisting his presence. When he reached out to touch it, a sharp jolt ran up his arm, forcing him to pull back with a gasp. It was then that he noticed the inscription at the base of the bell, words carved in an ancient script that seemed to shift and writhe under his gaze. "For the unworthy, the toll of reckoning." The congregation sat in stunned silence, the air thick with fear. The bell did not toll again that night, but its presence lingered, casting a long and ominous shadow over the church. Father Elias could not shake the feeling that it was not just an object, but something alive, something watching. The villagers left the church that evening with bowed heads, each whispering silent prayers for protection. And as the last candle was extinguished and the doors were locked, the faintest sound of a bell echoed once more, as though mocking their efforts to contain the darkness. In the days following the bell's mysterious appearance, the church became a place of unease rather than solace. The villagers, once eager to attend Mass or linger in its sacred halls, now hesitated to cross its threshold. Father Elias tried to reassure his flock, insisting the bell was merely an old relic that someone had mistakenly placed in the church. But even as he said the words, he felt the weight of the lie. Deep down, he knew there was nothing ordinary about the iron bell or the way it had appeared. The first reports of the shadows came a week after the bell's arrival. Mrs. Abernathy was the first to speak of it, though her account was dismissed as the ramblings of an old woman. She claimed that while lighting a candle at dusk, she had seen a figure seated in the back pews, a man in dark robes, his face obscured by shadow. When she approached to greet him, the figure vanished before her eyes, leaving behind a faint scent of ash. The villagers listened with polite skepticism, but the nervous glances they exchanged betrayed their growing unease. 2 days later, young Daniel, the village blacksmith's apprentice, stormed into the tavern pale as a ghost. He swore on his mother's grave that he had seen the same shadow while repairing a broken railing near the altar. He described it as tall and thin, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally in the flickering candlelight. "It wasn't human," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It moved like smoke, here one moment, gone the next." His testimony silenced the room, and by the next morning, the story had spread like wildfire. Father Elias decided to investigate. Armed with a lantern and a Bible, he entered the church alone at dusk. The air inside felt heavy and stagnant, as though the building itself was holding its breath. He walked the length of the nave, pausing to examine the pews and the shadows they cast. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The lantern's light flickered against the cold stone walls, and the only sound was the faint creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. It was near the altar that he saw it. At the farthest pew, where the light from his lantern barely reached, a shadow moved, slowly, deliberately, as though aware of his presence. Father Elias froze, gripping the Bible tightly in one hand. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing in the empty hall. The shadow did not reply. Instead, it shifted, elongating until it seemed to stretch across the entire pew like a pool of ink. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, leaving the priest staring into the empty darkness. Shaken but determined, Father Elias approached the pew. There was nothing there, no sign of movement, no sound. Yet the air felt colder, and he could not shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced toward the iron bell, which sat silently in its corner. It seemed to radiate an oppressive presence, as though it were aware of the disturbance it had caused. He considered touching it again, but remembered the searing jolt from before and decided against it. That night, Father Elias gathered a group of trusted parishioners to discuss what he had seen. Mrs. Abernathy, young Daniel, and a few others who had reported strange sightings sat around the table in the rectory, their faces pale and drawn. As the priest recounted his experience, he noticed a strange unity in their reactions, a mixture of fear and reluctant acknowledgement. "It's the bell," Mrs. Abernathy whispered finally. "It's brought something here, something that doesn't belong." The priest resisted the idea at first. To blame the bell felt too simplistic, too superstitious. But the more he listened, the more he realized there was no other explanation. The shadows, the oppressive air, the strange tolls, they had all started after the bell's arrival. "We need to get rid of it," Daniel said, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. "Throw it out, bury it, anything. It doesn't belong here." But it wasn't so simple. When Father Elias proposed moving the bell, he was met with immediate resistance from the congregation. Some feared angering whatever force had brought it, while others, particularly the older villagers, argued that it might be sacred a test from God. The debate grew heated, and by the end of the night, no decision had been reached. The bell would stay, at least for now. In the days that followed, the shadows grew bolder. Parishioners reported seeing them during Mass, darting between the pews or lingering near the altar. Some claimed to hear whispers, faint, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to rise from the very walls of the church. Attendance dwindled, and the once vibrant community began to fracture under the weight of fear. Father Elias, now doubting his own faith, found himself praying more often, though the words felt hollow. The shadows were no longer content to hide. They had begun to watch, to linger, and to spread. And as they grew stronger, so too did the ominous presence of the bell, its iron surface gleaming dully in the fading light. The church, once a place of sanctuary, had become a battleground between the seen and the unseen. And Father Elias knew that whatever was lurking in the shadows was only just beginning to reveal itself. The unease gripping the village worsened after Father Elias's failed attempt to unite the congregation. Shadows were no longer fleeting. Some now lingered long enough to be described in unsettling detail. The figure in the back pew, with robes like smudged charcoal, was seen by several parishioners. Its presence unnerved them, not because it moved, but because it didn't. It simply sat, watching, its featureless face angled toward the altar, as if waiting. It was Father Elias's decision to keep the church open despite the growing fear. The priest insisted that abandoning the sacred space would be an act of surrender, a defeat he wasn't willing to accept. But with every passing day, fewer villagers came to Mass. The pews were nearly empty during sermons, and even the most devout muttered excuses to avoid evening services. The church had become more haunted than holy. On the night of the first incident, the village was cloaked in an unnatural silence. There was no wind to rustle the trees, no hum of crickets or distant bark of dogs. Father Elias was alone in the rectory, preparing a sermon, when the first toll rang out. The deep, resonant clang of the iron bell echoed through the night, startling him so severely that his pen slipped, smudging ink across the page. For a moment, he thought it was a mistake, a trick of his imagination. Then it rang again. Father Elias grabbed his lantern and rushed to the church. His heart pounded as he pushed open the heavy doors, which groaned as though reluctant to let him in. Inside, the air was colder than usual, carrying a sharp metallic tang. The lantern's glow revealed the rows of empty pews, the altar, and the iron bell, still sitting motionless in its corner. It was then that he realized the bell had rung without being touched. It stood silent and untouched, yet its tolls had carried through the night like a warning. He called out into the empty church, his voice trembling but firm. "Who's there?" His words were swallowed by the vastness of the space, and only the faint echo replied. For a long moment, nothing stirred. Then, just as he began to lower his lantern, he noticed it. The shadow at the back pew, darker than the rest, seated like a parishioner awaiting absolution. This time, Father Elias refused to flee. He gripped the Bible in his free hand and approached the figure slowly, his footsteps echoing ominously in the stillness. "In the name of God, reveal yourself," he commanded, his voice shaking but resolute. The figure didn't move, but the temperature around him dropped sharply, and the lantern's flame flickered wildly, almost extinguishing itself. The closer he got, the less defined the shadow became. Its edges seemed to blur and writhe, as if it were not a person, but a distortion of reality itself. When he was just a few feet away, the shadow dissolved completely, leaving behind only the lingering scent of burned wood. Father Elias stood frozen, the lantern trembling in his hand. He turned his attention to the bell, suspecting it was the source of this terror, but he dared not touch it. The next morning, the village was buzzing with panic. Several villagers claimed they had heard the midnight tolls, and some insisted they'd seen figures moving in the church windows. Rumors spread like wildfire, each more exaggerated than the last. It wasn't long before the bell's tolling was interpreted as an omen, a harbinger of doom that would befall the village if it remained. In an emergency meeting, Father Elias addressed the villagers with as much calm as he could muster. "The church is not the source of this evil," he said, though his own doubts gnawed at his faith. "It is a sanctuary, a place of light. We cannot abandon it to shadows and fear." His words were met with murmurs of disagreement. More than a few voices called for the bell's removal, though none dared to suggest who would undertake the task. That night, as the village huddled in uneasy slumber, the bell tolled again. This time, the sound was deeper, almost guttural, as if something were pulling it from the depths of the earth itself. Those who heard it woke in cold sweats, and some claimed they could feel vibrations through the ground, as though the village itself had begun to quake under its influence. Father Elias sat awake in his room, staring at his lantern's feeble glow. He knew the tolls were escalating, and with them, the danger. The shadows were no longer content with their silent haunting. They were growing stronger, feeding off the fear they had sown. And somewhere deep in his soul, he felt a terrible truth forming. This was no ordinary bell. It was a conduit, a bridge to something far darker than he had ever faced. And whatever it had summoned wasn't waiting for an invitation. It was already here. By the fourth night after the bell's second tolling, the village teetered on the edge of hysteria. Doors were bolted long before sunset, and the streets emptied as shadows stretched their elongated fingers across cobblestones. Even the staunchest skeptics avoided speaking of the church aloud, as though naming it might summon its growing darkness. Only Father Elias remained steadfast, though each day seemed to age him more rapidly than the last. His once bright eyes were now rimmed with red, and the tremor in his hands had become noticeable even as he clutched his Bible. Father Elias resolved to stay in the church overnight, determined to confront whatever force had taken hold of his sanctuary. Armed with holy water, a crucifix, and an unshakable resolve, he prepared for a vigil that would last until dawn. He lit candles at every corner of the nave, their flickering flames creating an uneasy dance of light and shadow that transformed the familiar interior into something alien. The air was unnaturally still, as though the church itself was holding its breath. The first hours passed without incident, the oppressive silence broken only by the creak of wooden pews as the priest paced. Midnight came, and with it, an unsettling change. The candles nearest to the altar began to gutter, their flames dimming and flaring erratically. Father Elias tightened his grip on the crucifix, his whispered prayers growing louder, a chant to keep his courage intact. Then he heard it, a faint hum, low and discordant, as if carried from a distance by a wind that wasn't there. At first, he thought it might be the wind outside, but as the sound grew louder, he realized it was coming from within the church. It wasn't random. It was a melody, though not one he could place. The hum became a harmony, and then voices joined it. Soft at first, but unmistakable. A choir. The voices were not those of the villagers. They were chillingly pure, almost inhuman in their precision. They sang no hymn he recognized, their words twisted into a language that seemed ancient, unholy. Father Elias felt his knees weaken as the sound filled the space, reverberating off the stone walls and echoing into his very soul. The choir was invisible, yet its presence was palpable. The sound carried an oppressive weight, pressing on his chest and making it difficult to breathe. The priest staggered toward the altar, his voice trembling as he recited scripture. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." His words were drowned out by the rising crescendo of the choir, which grew impossibly louder, as if mocking his defiance. It was then that he noticed the shadows gathering at the edges of the church, coalescing into darker pools that moved with purpose. Suddenly, the bell rang again. Its toll was deafening, and the vibrations seemed to shake the very foundation of the church. The choir ceased immediately, leaving behind a silence that was almost more terrifying. The bell, which had not been touched by human hands in decades, now swung visibly. Father Elias stared, transfixed, as the iron clapper struck once more, releasing another echoing boom. It was then that he saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, not fully formed, but unmistakably humanoid. Their features were indistinct, their bodies translucent and shifting, like smoke given form. They moved toward the bell, their movements jerky and unnatural, as though struggling to maintain their shape. Father Elias raised the crucifix, shouting a prayer of exorcism, but the figures paid him no mind. Their focus was entirely on the bell. As the third toll resounded, the figures turned their attention to Father Elias. He froze, paralyzed by a wave of cold that swept through him. Their faces, or the suggestion of them, seemed to ripple with malevolence. The priest stumbled backward, his words faltering as his mind grappled with the impossibility of what he was witnessing. He hurled the holy water in their direction, and for a moment, the figures recoiled, their forms flickering as though disrupted. But the reprieve was brief. The shadows advanced again, and this time, they began to whisper. Their voices were faint but distinct, calling out in languages he couldn't understand. Yet somehow their intent was clear. They were taunting him, mocking his faith, his frailty. Father Elias's resolve began to crumble as he felt the weight of their malice pressing against his mind. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The shadows dissolved, the air warmed, and the bell fell silent. Father Elias collapsed to his knees, gasping for air as tears streamed down his face. The church returned to its unnatural stillness, but the priest knew it was only temporary. The bell had become a beacon, and the choir was merely the prelude. As dawn broke, Father Elias emerged from the church, his face pale and his eyes hollow. The villagers who dared approach found him muttering incoherently about the choir and the shadows. But when asked what must be done, his response chilled them to the bone. "It's not the church they want," he whispered. "It's us. They're only waiting." Word of Father Elias's ordeal spread through the village like wildfire, and by the evening, a group of villagers had gathered in the square to decide their next course of action. The priest's cryptic warnings about the shadows and the choir left the townsfolk divided. Some believed his tale was evidence of divine punishment, while others dismissed it as the ramblings of a man under too much strain. Regardless of their beliefs, one sentiment united them. The church had become a place of fear, no longer a sanctuary, but a threat. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised hues of purple and orange, the bell tolled again. This time, it rang only once, but the sound was sharper, more menacing, reverberating far beyond the village. A hush fell over the crowd. All eyes turned toward the church, its silhouette stark against the twilight. Father Elias emerged from his quarters, his face a mask of exhaustion. "It's starting again," he murmured, clutching his Bible tightly. He pleaded with the villagers to remain in their homes, to lock their doors and windows. But fear, once sown, often sprouts rebellion. A group of men led by the village blacksmith, Lucas, declared they would confront whatever evil resided in the church. Armed with torches and farm tools, the group marched toward the church, their determination masking the dread that gnawed at their resolve. The church loomed larger as they approached, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the ground. The torches illuminated the cracked stone walls and the heavy oak doors, which now bore fresh scratches, as though clawed at by something desperate to get in or out. Father Elias followed reluctantly, his protest drowned out by the rising chants of the men. "If you disturb it further, it will only grow stronger," he warned. But Lucas waved him off, his hammer resting heavily on his shoulder. "We'll end this tonight, Father. No more ghost stories." The group pushed open the church doors, their torches casting flickering light into the cavernous interior. At first, everything seemed untouched. The pews were orderly, the altar pristine. But as they ventured deeper, the temperature dropped. The air was thick, oppressive, and carried a faint metallic tang, like blood. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado waning. Then came the whispering. It started faintly, like the rustling of leaves, but quickly grew into an unintelligible cacophony. The men spun in all directions, their torches casting wild shadows on the walls. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Father Elias gripped his crucifix, reciting prayers under his breath. Suddenly, the bell rang again, louder than before, though the tower remained still. The sound was followed by a horrific scream that froze the group in their tracks. One of the younger men, Thomas, dropped his torch and bolted for the door, only to find it shut tight. He pounded against it, his cries mingling with the escalating whispers. Lucas shouted orders, but the men were too panicked to listen. From the shadows of the nave, figures began to materialize, tall, indistinct forms that seemed to waver like heat mirages. Their movements were slow but deliberate, and as they advanced, the whispers coalesced into a single voice, deep and resonant. "You were warned." The men's torches flickered and died, plunging the church into darkness. Screams echoed as the figures closed in, their forms becoming more defined. Hollow eyes, gaping mouths, and elongated limbs that defied human proportions. Father Elias shouted prayers, his voice cracking with desperation, but the figures did not waver. In the chaos, Lucas swung his hammer wildly, the metallic clang echoing as it struck stone. "Fight them!" he roared, but it was futile. The figures seemed impervious to physical attacks, their forms dissipating only to reform moments later. One by one, the men disappeared into the shadows, their screams abruptly silenced. When the cacophony subsided, only Father Elias remained, kneeling in the center of the church. The figures encircled him, but did not approach. Instead, they dissolved into the air, leaving only the faintest trace of their presence. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of the bell tolling once more. When dawn arrived, the villagers found Father Elias alone in the church, his hands clasped tightly around his Bible. He was uninjured but unresponsive, his lips moving in silent prayer. Of Lucas and his men, there was no trace, save for the abandoned tools scattered across the stone floor. The villagers knew now that the church was no longer a place for the living. The disappearance of Lucas and his men cast a shadow over the village that even the rising sun could not dispel. Whispers of their fate filled the air, each version darker than the last. Some claimed the men had been consumed by the spirits, their souls trapped within the church walls. Others swore they had seen the shadows of the missing lingering near the bell tower, their outlines distorted and unnatural. Whatever the truth, the church had become a silent sentinel of terror, its looming presence a constant reminder of their failure. Father Elias, though physically unscathed, had retreated into an almost catatonic state. He refused food and water, spending his days and nights locked in fervent prayer. When approached, he would murmur fragments of scripture, his eyes fixed on an unseen point beyond the horizon. The villagers, desperate for leadership, turned to Marta, the village healer and elder, who had always been wary of the church's recent disturbances. Marta was a stoic woman with a presence that demanded respect. Her home, a small cottage filled with dried herbs and talismans, became the epicenter of the villagers' planning. Unlike Father Elias, she was not bound by doctrine. Her understanding of the supernatural stemmed from old traditions passed down through generations. "This is no ordinary haunting," she told the gathered crowd. "The church has become a conduit, but for what, I cannot yet say." The villagers begged her to find a solution, but Marta was hesitant. She explained that to combat the darkness, they would need to venture deeper into its origins, something that came with great risk. After much deliberation, she agreed to perform a ritual to reveal the source of the malevolence. "But understand this," she warned. "Once we see its face, it will see ours." As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Marta prepared her ritual. A circle of salt and ash was drawn in the churchyard, the only place close enough to the building without entering it. At its center, she placed an assortment of items: an iron dagger, a black candle, and a mirror smudged with soot. The villagers gathered around her, their faces pale but determined. Father Elias was carried out to witness the ritual, his silence broken only by muttered prayers. Marta lit the candle, its flame unnaturally steady despite the night breeze. She chanted in a language unfamiliar to most, her voice low and resonant. As the words spilled from her lips, the air grew heavy, the faint scent of burning metal mingling with the night. The mirror's surface began to ripple like water, and then an image emerged. At first, it was the nave of the church, dimly lit by phantom light. Then, the scene shifted, revealing a grotesque tableau. Figures, twisted and disfigured, were hunched over the altar, their movements jerky and unnatural. At their center stood a tall, robed figure, its face obscured by a hood. In its hands, it held a bell that shone with a sinister light, the very sound of its toll reverberating in the villagers' ears. Marta gasped, her composure faltering. "The bell keeper," she whispered. "An ancient guardian of thresholds, but it has been corrupted. Something has invited it here." The mirror suddenly cracked, sending a shard flying across the circle. The candle flame extinguished itself, plunging the yard into darkness. For a moment, all was silent. Then, from the church, came the sound of laughter, low, guttural, and inhuman. It echoed across the village, freezing everyone in place. Marta scrambled to her feet, clutching the dagger tightly. "We've drawn its attention," she said, her voice trembling. "We have little time before it moves against us." She turned to Father Elias, shaking him out of his stupor. "You must tell us the truth, Elias. What happened in the church before this began?" Father Elias stared at her, his face stricken with guilt. "It was not me," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "It was the choir. They were experimenting, testing the limits of what we could summon in praise. They believed they could bring heaven closer. I did not stop them in time." The crowd recoiled, their fear mingling with anger. Marta silenced them with a raised hand. "We cannot afford blame," she said sharply. "What is done is done. Now, we must act quickly before the bell keeper claims more of us." The villagers had hoped the ritual would provide clarity, but instead, it had brought a grim revelation. The corruption within the church was not an accident, but a consequence of human ambition. As they dispersed into the night, they knew the fight ahead would not just be against the darkness, but also against their own guilt and fear. The days following Marta's revelation were a blur of dread and determination. The villagers worked tirelessly to prepare for the inevitable confrontation with the bell keeper. Marta took the lead, delegating tasks and sharing fragments of her knowledge about warding against malevolent spirits. Salt lines were reinforced around homes. Iron nails were driven into door frames, and every candle in the village was blessed with a prayer for protection. Yet the sense of foreboding only deepened, like the weight of an approaching storm. Father Elias, once a symbol of steadfast faith, was now a shadow of his former self. He spent his days in the chapel of Marta's home, reciting scripture and begging for forgiveness. It was clear to everyone that guilt consumed him, but his fragmented confessions provided little insight. Marta, frustrated by his evasiveness, decided to confront him directly. "You know more than you're saying, Elias," she accused one evening. "If we are to stand a chance, we need the full truth." Under the weight of her gaze, Elias finally broke. There was a hymn, he admitted, his voice shaking. The choir found it in a collection of ancient texts, long forgotten in the church archives. They believed it to be a relic of divine power, a hymn that could bridge the gap between this world and the heavens. They sang it during the last service, and that's when it all began. The hymn wasn't holy, it was a summons. The room fell silent as his words sank in. Marta's expression darkened. "Where is this hymn now?" she demanded. Elias gestured weakly toward the church. "The sheet music is still in the vestry. But be warned, it carries a curse. Even reading it aloud feels like stepping into the void." Marta considered his words, her mind racing. The hymn was the key, both to the calamity that had befallen the village and perhaps to reversing it. But retrieving it would mean venturing back into the church, the very heart of the darkness. The villagers were terrified at the prospect, but Marta knew there was no other choice. That night, Marta assembled a small group of the bravest villagers. Armed with lanterns, iron tools, and their collective courage, they approached the church. The air around the building was thick and cold, carrying an unnatural stillness that made their footsteps sound deafening. The heavy wooden doors creaked open as if protesting their intrusion, revealing the shadowed interior. The group moved cautiously, their lanterns casting trembling light onto the warped pews and broken altar. Every shadow seemed alive, shifting and twisting in the periphery of their vision. The vestry door loomed ahead, and Marta steeled herself before pushing it open. Inside, the room was eerily untouched, as if frozen in time since the choir's last practice. On the desk, half buried under scattered hymnals, lay a sheet of yellowed parchment. The notes and lyrics scrawled across it pulsed faintly, as though imbued with a life of their own. Marta hesitated before picking it up, her fingers tingling with an unnatural chill. As soon as the paper left the desk, a low rumble echoed through the church, and the lanterns flickered violently. The group froze as an unholy wind swept through the nave, carrying with it a cacophony of whispers. The shadows on the walls coalesced into grotesque forms, figures with elongated limbs and eyeless faces. They advanced slowly, their movements deliberate and menacing. Marta shouted for everyone to retreat, clutching the cursed hymn tightly to her chest. As they fled the church, the shadows pursued them, their distorted limbs clawing at the air. The villagers outside watched in horror as the group emerged, the church doors slamming shut behind them as if sealing the darkness within. Marta stumbled to her knees, breathless but clutching the sheet music. The shadows dissipated at the church's threshold, retreating into the building like smoke drawn into a vent. The group reconvened at Marta's home, shaken but relieved to have escaped with the hymn. Marta unrolled the parchment and studied it by candlelight. The notes were intricate and dissonant, the lyrics written in a language she did not recognize. She turned to Father Elias, who had been anxiously awaiting their return. "Do you understand this language?" she asked. Elias nodded solemnly. "It's a mix of Old Latin and an older dialect, one even the church doesn't fully understand. I can translate it, but it will take time." Marta placed the hymn on the table. "Then do so quickly. This is no ordinary music. It's a weapon. The bell-keeper was summoned by this hymn, and I suspect it can also be banished by it. But we'll need to understand it first." The villagers, though heartened by the glimmer of hope, could not shake the memory of the living shadows. The church had let them go this time, but it was clear that whatever resided within would not rest until its dark purpose was fulfilled. The hymn lay on Marta's kitchen table like a silent predator, its curling notes and cryptic lyrics exuding an air of malevolence. Father Elias pored over the parchment, whispering fragments of translation under his breath. His face, lined with exhaustion, grew paler with every deciphered word. The rest of the villagers gathered in the adjoining room, their hushed conversations laced with fear. All eyes turned toward the kitchen door, as though Elias and Marta's efforts were their only barrier against impending doom. By morning, Elias had pieced together the meaning of the hymn. His voice trembled as he shared his findings. "This is not a song meant for worship," he began, clutching the parchment tightly. "It is an invocation, a plea to something beyond human comprehension. It speaks of a keeper, a being that guards the threshold between realms. The hymn does not summon it. It invites its judgment." The room erupted into a cacophony of voices. Some villagers questioned the purpose of such a hymn. Others demanded to know why it had been hidden in their church's archives. Marta silenced them with a raised hand. "What matters now is how we use it. If this hymn brought the bell-keeper here, there must be a way to send it back." Elias hesitated, his eyes haunted. "Perhaps, but the lyrics speak of balance. To undo what was done, there must be an exchange. A price must be paid." Marta's heart sank. "What kind of price?" Elias shook his head. "The hymn is vague, but it suggests that the keeper will not leave empty-handed. Someone must willingly offer themselves as payment." A heavy silence fell over the room. No one dared to meet Marta's gaze. The weight of leadership pressed heavily on her shoulders, but she refused to let despair take root. "If sacrifice is the only way, then we'll find another solution first," she said firmly. "We'll exhaust every option before resigning ourselves to that fate." The village's fragile unity began to fray as fear and desperation took hold. Some whispered of leaving the village altogether, abandoning the church and its horrors. Others clung to the hope that Marta would find a way to banish the Keeper without loss. Tensions rose, and the once close-knit community grew divided. That night, Marta couldn't sleep. The ominous tolling of the bell echoed faintly in the distance, a reminder of the looming threat. She sat by the fire, the hymn open before her. The notes seemed to shimmer in the firelight, their allure both mesmerizing and repulsive. Marta couldn't help but hum a few bars under her breath, the melody dark and haunting. The air in the room grew cold, and a faint whisper brushed her ear, though she was alone. Startled, she stopped humming and stared at the parchment. "What are you trying to tell me?" she muttered, as though the hymn could answer. At that moment, a soft knock came at her door. Marta opened it to find an elderly woman, a recluse named Greta, standing there. Greta rarely spoke to anyone, but her expression was one of urgency. "I know the Keeper," she said in a raspy voice. "I've seen it before. Many years ago." Marta invited her in, eager for any insight. Greta's hands trembled as she recounted her story. "I was a child when it came to our village once before. My grandmother told me it came for the unrepentant, those who thought they could cheat the natural order. She said it doesn't choose victims at random, it judges. And if it finds the village unworthy, it takes everything." Marta listened intently, her mind racing. "How did your village survive?" Greta looked away, tears welling in her eyes. "We didn't. Only a handful escaped. The hymn was sung, but no one offered themselves. The Keeper took the entire church, the priest, the congregation. Everything inside was swallowed by darkness." The revelation chilled Marta to her core. She knew now that time was running out. The Bell Keeper was no aimless terror. It was a force of retribution. And unless they could find a way to appease it or stop it, history would repeat itself, leaving nothing but emptiness where the village once stood. The morning broke with an unsettling calm. A thick mist clung to the village like a shroud, muffling sound and casting every familiar landmark in ghostly obscurity. Marta stood at the edge of the churchyard, staring at the bell tower as the mist swirled around its base. The bell had been silent all night, but its presence was palpable, as though it was watching, waiting for the next move. Father Elias approached, his expression grave. "We have to act, Marta," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The villagers are growing restless. They need answers, and we are running out of time." Marta nodded, her thoughts racing. Greta's harrowing story weighed heavily on her, but it also brought clarity. The Bell Keeper wasn't just a threat, it was a judgment. The village's survival depended on understanding the Keeper's rules and using them to their advantage. Inside the church, the air was heavy with unease. The hymnal lay open on the altar, its sinister melody etched into the fragile pages. Marta and Elias stood before it, joined by a handful of villagers who refused to flee. Among them was young Samuel, whose faith in Marta was unwavering, and Greta, her frail frame an anchor of grim wisdom. "We need to understand its nature," Marta said, her voice firm despite the dread gnawing at her resolve. "If the Keeper judges, then it must have rules. Something that binds it." Greta stepped forward, her voice quivering but resolute. "The Keeper judges communities, not individuals. It looks for harmony, for balance. If there is dissent, it sees weakness. That's why my village failed, because we fractured under fear." Elias frowned. "But how do we unify a village that's already breaking apart? People are leaving, and those who stay are divided." Marta's gaze hardened. "We show them the truth. We face the Keeper together. Fear thrives in ignorance, but if they understand what we're up against, they might stand with us." Elias hesitated but nodded. "Then we summon it in full view of the village." "But Marta, if we do this, there's no turning back." That evening, Marta and Elias gathered the remaining villagers in the churchyard. Word had spread quickly, and even those who had planned to flee returned, curiosity outweighing their fear. A bonfire crackled in the center, its light casting flickering shadows on the faces of the gathered crowd. Marta stepped forward, her voice carrying over the tense silence. "The bell's toll is not a warning, it's a summons," she began, her tone commanding yet tinged with urgency. "The keeper has come to judge us, and it won't stop until its verdict is delivered. But we have a choice. If we stand together, if we show strength, we may yet survive. Divided, we will fall." Her words were met with murmurs of doubt, but Greta stepped forward, lending her voice to Marta's plea. She recounted her story, sparing no detail, and the gravity of her account silenced the crowd. Even the most skeptical among them began to understand the stakes. Elias stepped up to the bell tower, the rope dangling ominously. "The hymn is the key," he said. "It brought the keeper here, and it may be our only chance to understand its will. But this must be a collective act. We must face it together." The crowd shifted uneasily, but no one stepped away. With a deep breath, Elias pulled the rope, and the bell's toll reverberated through the night. The sound was deafening, a bone-chilling resonance that seemed to pierce the very soul. The villagers clutched each other, their fear palpable, but no one fled. As the final toll faded, the mist thickened, curling around the church like a living thing. Shadows began to move within it, shapes that defied reason, their forms shifting and writhing. The bonfire's light dimmed, swallowed by the encroaching dark. And then from the depths of the mist came a voice, not loud, but all-encompassing, as though the air itself had spoken. "You call, and I come. What will you offer?" The villagers froze, their terror complete. Marta stepped forward, her heart pounding, but her resolve unbroken. "We offer truth," she said, her voice steady. "We stand united. Judge us if you must, but you will see our strength." The shadows stopped moving, and the voice fell silent. For a moment, all was still, and then the mist began to recede, revealing a figure standing at the churchyard's edge. It was humanoid yet otherworldly, its form cloaked in darkness, with glowing eyes that burned like embers. The bellkeeper had arrived. The bellkeeper stood unmoving, its form cloaked in shadows that seemed to devour the light around it. The villagers held their collective breath, every eye locked on the spectral figure. Its glowing eyes swept across the crowd, lingering on each person as though it could see through their skin, straight into their souls. A suffocating silence enveloped the churchyard, broken only by the crackling of the dying bonfire. Marta took a tentative step forward, her pulse hammering in her ears. The keeper's gaze snapped to her, and she felt an unbearable weight press down on her shoulders, as if the entity's presence alone could crush her will. But she refused to falter. With a steady voice, she called out, "What do you want from us?" The keeper's reply was not spoken, but felt. A wave of cold surged through the air, and the villagers instinctively drew closer together. The entity raised a hand, or what passed for a hand in its amorphous form, and pointed toward the church. A low, guttural voice resonated in their minds. "The hymn binds you. The hymn frees you. One must atone, and the rest may thrive." A murmur rippled through the crowd, panic rising like a tide. The hymn, the cursed melody that had haunted their lives since its discovery. Elias stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "What does it mean by 'one must atone'?" he asked, his voice shaking only slightly. The keeper did not answer directly. Instead, it gestured toward the bell tower, and the villagers turned as one. The bell swayed slightly, though no wind touched it. Its motion seemed alive, purposeful. Marta's heart sank as she realized the implication. The bell was the arbiter. It would decide who among them would pay the price. Greta's frail voice broke the silence. "It's a sacrifice," she whispered, her words barely audible over the mounting fear. "One of us must die." The villagers erupted in protest. Shouts of denial, fear, and anger filled the air. Some cried out that they would never allow such a thing, while others cast accusatory glances, the seeds of division quickly taking root. Marta raised her hands, her voice rising above the chaos. "Stop! This is what it wants, to break us apart. We must think clearly." Elias nodded, stepping to her side. If we let fear guide us, we'll be no better than the village Greta came from. We need to face this together. But unity was already slipping through their fingers. Samuel, the young boy who had clung to Marta's side, now trembled, his wide eyes darting between the villagers and the keeper. "Why does it have to be anyone?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why can't it just leave us alone?" The keeper's eyes flared brighter, and its voice echoed once more. "Harmony demands balance. One must fall, so the many may rise." With those words, the bonfire extinguished completely, plunging the churchyard into near darkness. Only the keeper's glowing eyes and the faint light from the bell tower provided any illumination. Marta felt a deep despair settle over her. How could they make such a choice? Could they even trust the keeper's promise that the rest would survive? Yet, as she scanned the crowd, she realized the decision would not be made by logic or reason. Fear was already eroding their fragile unity, and if they didn't act swiftly, the keeper's judgment would come regardless. She turned to Elias. "We need to understand the hymn. If it binds and frees us, it must hold the key to escaping this nightmare." Elias nodded, his face grim. "Then we go back into the church. All of us. Together." The villagers hesitated, but one by one, they followed Marta and Elias toward the looming doors of the church. The keeper remained at the edge of the yard, watching in silence, its presence a constant reminder of the stakes. As the group entered the church, Marta silently prayed that the answers they sought would reveal themselves before it was too late. Behind her, the bell tolled once more, its haunting sound marking the beginning of their race against time. The church doors groaned as Marta pushed them open, their heavy wooden panels seeming to resist her efforts as though the building itself wished to trap them outside. Inside, the air was cold and thick with the smell of old stone and damp wood. Shadows danced along the walls, cast by the flickering light of a few remaining candles. The group huddled together, their fear palpable. Even the boldest among them dared not stray too far from the group as they entered the hallowed space. The bell's toll had ceased, but its echo seemed to linger in the stillness, a constant reminder of the keeper's demand. Marta took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the pews and the altar for any sign of where to begin. The hymn had been their curse, but perhaps it could also be their salvation. "The answer is here," she said firmly, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. Elias stepped beside her, his gaze fixed on the old organ at the far end of the nave. "The hymn started with that," he said. "The night we first played it, everything changed." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken guilt. He had been the one to play it, lured by the strange notes written in the forgotten hymn book. Greta, clutching her shawl tightly around her thin frame, spoke up from the back. "The hymn isn't just music," she said. "It's an incantation. My mother warned us of songs that could open doors to things we couldn't comprehend. This must be one of them." Marta nodded, her mind racing. If the hymn binds and frees, then it must be reversible. We need to find a way to undo what was started. She turned toward the organ, determination replacing her fear. "Elias, can you remember the melody?" "Every note." Elias hesitated, his brow furrowing. "I can remember it, but playing it again might only make things worse." "What if?" "We don't have time for what-ifs," Marta interrupted. "The keeper won't wait forever, and we need to act before it takes someone from us." Her voice carried a weight that silenced the group, their collective fear giving way to reluctant acceptance. The villagers moved as one toward the organ, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Elias sat before the keys, his fingers trembling as they hovered above them. Marta placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "Play it exactly as you remember, but slow enough that we can study each note." He nodded, drawing in a shaky breath. The first note rang out, haunting and dissonant, filling the church with a sound that seemed to reverberate beyond the physical. The villagers flinched, their unease growing as Elias played on. Each note carried an otherworldly weight, as though the music itself were alive and listening. Marta stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the hymn book laid open on the organ. The strange notations, written in an unfamiliar script, seemed to shift and shimmer in the candlelight. She reached out to touch the page, her fingers brushing against the ink. A sharp chill shot through her hand, and she gasped, pulling away. "What happened?" Elias asked, his fingers pausing on the keys. It's reacting," Marta said, holding up her hand, which now bore faint black markings resembling the script on the page. "The hymn isn't just music, it's a language, a spell." Greta stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she examined the markings. "If it's a spell, then there must be a counterspell. Look at the back of the book. Spells often have reversals." Marta quickly flipped through the brittle pages, her heart pounding as she scanned the text. At last, she found a passage written in the same shifting script, accompanied by a series of notes unlike those of the original hymn. "This must be it," she whispered. "The counterspell." The villagers crowded around, their fear momentarily replaced by hope. Elias studied the notes, his brow furrowing. It's like the original hymn, but inverted. "I can play it, but we need to be prepared for whatever happens next." As he positioned his fingers over the keys, once more, Marta turned to the group. "Stay close. Whatever comes, we face it together." Her words rallied them, and for a moment, the unity they had lost earlier returned. Elias began to play, the inverted melody echoing through the church. The air grew colder with each note, and the candles flickered wildly, as though caught in an unseen storm. The villagers held their breath, their eyes darting toward the doors and windows, half expecting the keeper to burst in at any moment. The final note lingered in the air, a resonant sound that seemed to stretch beyond time. The church fell silent, the oppressive weight of the hymn lifting slightly. But as the last echoes faded, a deep, guttural growl rose from beneath the floorboards, shaking the very foundation of the church. Marta's heart sank. They had awakened something far worse than the keeper. The ground trembled as the growl reverberated through the church, the vibrations rattling loose the dust from its ancient rafters. Panic rippled through the villagers as they clung to the pews for balance, their terrified eyes fixed on the floorboards, which now seemed to pulse like a living thing. Marta froze, her breath caught in her throat. The hymn's counterspell had done something, but not what they had hoped. "It's coming from below," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible over the rumbling. He backed away from the organ, his face pale. "We've disturbed something buried, something that was meant to stay hidden." Marta clenched her fists, summoning every ounce of courage she could muster. "If it's beneath us, there must be a way to reach it. We can't leave it unchecked. We have to face it head on." "Face what?" Greta demanded, her voice shrill with fear. "The keeper was bad enough. Whatever's down there could be worse. We should run while we can." "And go where?" Marta shot back. "The keeper will find us if we leave. It wanted us to do this. We don't have a choice." Before Greta could respond, the floorboards near the altar cracked and splintered with a deafening snap. The villagers screamed and stumbled back as a jagged hole opened in the floor, revealing a dark, yawning void below. A foul stench wafted upward, carrying the scent of decay and something far older than the church itself. The group stood frozen, their collective fear silencing any argument. Marta stepped forward, her hand tightening on the strap of the satchel she carried. "If this is where the answers lie, then this is where I'm going. I need to know what we've awakened." Elias hesitated, his jaw tightening. "You're not going alone." He grabbed a candelabra from one of the pews and lit the remaining candles with trembling hands. The soft light illuminated his determined face. "If we did this together, we'll finish it together." One by one, the other villagers stepped forward, their reluctance outweighed by their shared sense of guilt and desperation. Even Greta, though visibly shaking, nodded her agreement. Marta felt a surge of gratitude, but pushed it aside, knowing their unity might be fleeting if the horrors below were worse than imagined. The descent began with Marta leading the way, her steps careful on the crumbling staircase that spiraled into the void. The walls of the passage were carved from stone, damp and slick with a black substance that smelled of iron and rot. The faint glow of the candelabra cast eerie shadows that seemed to move independently of their own. As they descended deeper, the growling grew louder, joined by an otherworldly humming that vibrated through their bones. Marta's pulse quickened. The hymn's melody echoed faintly within the hum, as though the song itself was alive and waiting. At the bottom of the staircase, they emerged into a vast chamber illuminated by a pale, unnatural light. The walls were covered in strange, writhing symbols that seemed to shift and twist under their gaze. In the center of the room stood a towering stone monolith, its surface carved with the same shifting script as the hymn book. "What is this place?" Elias murmured, his voice trembling with awe and terror. Greta clutched her shawl, her eyes wide. "It's older than the church, older than the village. This was never meant to be found." Marta approached the monolith, her heart pounding. The markings on its surface glowed faintly as she neared, the same black symbols now visible on her hand. She reached out, compelled by a force she couldn't explain, and placed her palm against the stone. A surge of energy shot through her, and her vision blurred as images flooded her mind. She saw the church as it had once been, a site of worship not for salvation, but for binding. The hymn had been a ritual to seal something ancient and malevolent beneath the earth, a force the villagers had unknowingly disturbed. Marta staggered back, gasping for air. The hymn, it wasn't meant to free us, she choked out. It was meant to keep it imprisoned. The growling intensified, shaking the chamber as cracks began to form in the monolith. The villagers screamed, their terror reaching a fever pitch. Marta's mind raced. The keeper had used them to weaken the seal, but for what purpose? Was it truly an enemy of the entity below, or a servant of something even more sinister? Before she could voice her thoughts, the monolith shattered, and the room was plunged into darkness. In the silence that followed, a voice spoke, deep and resonant, echoing from every corner of the chamber. "You have released me. Now, your world will pay the price." Marta's blood ran cold. They had awakened not just an ancient evil, but a force that threatened to consume everything they had ever known. The nightmare was far from over, and the real battle had just begun. The chamber erupted into chaos as the malevolent voice reverberated through the cavern, shaking the very foundation of the ancient stone walls. The villagers scrambled backward, their shadows flitting wildly in the faint glow of the candelabra. Marta stood frozen in place, her mind spinning as she tried to process the gravity of what they had unleashed. The entity's words lingered, filling the room with an oppressive dread. "Get to the stairs," Elias shouted, his voice cutting through the cacophony. He grabbed Greta's arm and began pulling her toward the spiraling steps, but the path was no longer clear. As if in response to their attempted retreat, thick, black tendrils slithered up from the cracks in the chamber floor, coiling around the base of the staircase. The exit was blocked, leaving them trapped in the malevolent embrace of the cavern. "What do we do now?" Greta whimpered, tears streaming down her face. She clung to Elias, trembling uncontrollably. Marta's eyes darted around the room, searching for any clue, any means of fighting back. The shattered remains of the monolith glimmered faintly on the ground, their shifting symbols still glowing dimly. Her gaze then shifted to the markings on her own hand, which now pulsated in sync with the entity's thrumming presence. "This thing," Marta said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "It was sealed with the hymn. That means it can be bound again. We just have to figure out how." "That's madness," shouted one of the villagers, a gaunt man named Walter. "Do you hear it? It's not something we can control. It's already too late." "It's only too late if we give up," Marta shot back, her tone sharp. She moved closer to the glowing fragments of the monolith, her instincts guiding her toward the remnants of its power. "The hymn brought us here for a reason. There has to be something in these symbols that can stop this." Elias stepped beside her, his face set with grim determination. "If anyone can figure this out, it's you. Tell me what you need." Marta knelt by the fragments, running her fingers over their smooth, etched surfaces. The symbols seemed to shift and arrange themselves as her touch lingered, forming patterns that matched the verses of the hymn in the ancient book. She realized with a jolt of clarity that the hymn had more verses, ones they had not sung. "These markings," she said, her voice rising with urgency. They're a continuation of the hymn. There's more to the spell, but it was hidden. If we can sing these verses, we might be able to rebind it. Greta let out a hollow laugh, the sound verging on hysteria. And how are we supposed to sing anything when that thing is crawling its way into our heads? As if in response to her words, the black tendrils began to writhe more violently, their movements creating an unbearable screeching sound. One of the villagers screamed as a tendril lashed out, wrapping around his leg and dragging him toward the center of the chamber. He clawed at the ground, his cries echoing in the cavern as the others stood paralyzed in horror. "Help him!" Elias yelled, but before anyone could move, the tendril tightened its grip and yanked the man into the darkness. His screams were abruptly silenced, leaving an oppressive stillness that seemed to smother the air. "This thing isn't waiting," Marta said through gritted teeth. She grabbed the fragments and handed them to Elias. "You and the others start memorizing these symbols. We don't have time to be perfect. We just have to sing. What about you?" Elias asked, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I'll buy us time," Marta replied. She stood and faced the pulsing darkness, the markings on her hand glowing brighter with each step she took toward the center of the chamber. The entity's presence loomed, its formless mass swirling like an impending storm. She didn't know what she could possibly do against something so ancient and powerful, but she knew one thing: they wouldn't make it out if she didn't try. As the villagers hesitantly began to hum the first few notes of the new verses, Marta raised her voice, her words cutting through the oppressive darkness. "You want to sacrifice?" she called out, her tone defiant. "Then face me. Leave them out of this." The growling intensified, the vibrations rattling her bones. The tendrils paused, as if considering her words, before retreating slightly from the others. Marta's pulse quickened. It had heard her, and it was responding. For the first time, Marta felt the entity's focus fully on her, its presence pressing against her mind like a suffocating weight. But in that moment of terror, she also felt a glimmer of hope. If it wanted her, it wasn't invincible, and if it could be distracted long enough, the hymn might still save them. The air in the chamber thickened as the villagers, trembling and hesitant, gathered around the fragments of the shattered monolith. The glowing symbols etched into the pieces pulsed faintly, almost as if the hymn was alive, waiting for them to breathe life into its forgotten verses. Marta remained at the chamber's center, standing defiantly as the entity's swirling darkness coalesced into a more focused form, a towering, inky shadow with glowing red fissures running through its torso. It loomed over her, and for the first time, its voice was sharp, directed, and chillingly human. "You believe your voices can bind me again?" the entity hissed, its tone laced with disdain. "Your ancestors failed. So will you?" The tendrils surrounding Marta lashed out, but she stood firm, her glowing markings forming a barrier that repelled them just enough to keep her alive. She didn't know how long her defense would hold, but every second counted. Turning her head slightly, she shouted to the others, "Start singing! Now!" Elias hesitated, his hand shaking as he held one of the fragments. The symbols danced before his eyes, rearranging themselves in patterns that seemed just out of reach of his understanding. "I don't know if we're reading this right," he said, his voice quivering. "You don't have to be perfect," Marta yelled, her voice cracking under the strain of holding her ground. "Just sing. Follow the melody of the original hymn. Trust it." The villagers began, their voices shaky and unsure, but the melody was unmistakable. The first few notes filled the cavern, soft and tentative, but as they continued, the glow of the fragments brightened. The symbols seemed to respond, pulsating in rhythm with their song. The oppressive energy in the room wavered for a moment, and the tendrils recoiled slightly. The entity let out a guttural growl, its fissures glowing brighter as it lashed out again, this time sending a tendril hurtling toward the group. Greta screamed, ducking just in time as the tendril struck the wall behind her, sending chunks of stone cascading to the ground. "We're going to die if we mess this up," she cried. "You're going to die if you stop," Marta retorted, her voice fierce. She turned back to the entity, her eyes blazing. "Is that all you've got? You're afraid of a song?" The shadow roared, its form flickering like a flame caught in the wind. "You dare mock me?" it bellowed. The ground beneath Marta's feet trembled as the fissures in the entity's body expanded, spilling crimson light across the chamber. The sight was terrifying, but it also revealed something crucial. The entity was weakening. The hymn was working. Encouraged, Elias raised his voice, leading the others in the next verse. The melody grew stronger, more confident, as the villagers poured every ounce of their will into the song. The fragments of the monolith began to levitate, circling above their heads and casting beams of light that cut through the darkness. Marta felt the entity's fury intensify, but she also sensed its fear. It wasn't invincible. It was bound by rules, by the very forces the hymn commanded. She stepped closer to the shadow, the glow of her markings now so bright that the tendrils could no longer touch her. "You can still stop this," she said, her voice low but firm. "Go back to where you came from." The entity snarled, its form flickering again. "You think this ends with you?" It spat. "Even if you bind me, the hymn will demand its price." "It always does." Marta's stomach twisted at the words, but she didn't falter. The hymn was their only hope, and she refused to let fear sway her. "Then we'll pay it," she said, her voice steady. "But not with our lives, not with our souls." The villagers reached the hymn's final verse, their voices rising to a crescendo. The fragments of the monolith came together in a burst of light, forming a glowing sigil in the air above Marta. The sigil descended, its radiant energy engulfing the shadowy entity. The creature let out a piercing scream, its form unraveling like smoke caught in a gale. The light intensified, blinding everyone in the chamber. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, as the glow faded, the villagers found themselves standing in an eerily still chamber. The tendrils had vanished, and the oppressive energy was gone. Marta collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The markings on her hand had faded, leaving only faint scars. Elias rushed to her side, helping her to her feet. Did we do it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marta looked around the chamber, her heart pounding. The entity was gone, but the sigil still hovered faintly in the air, its glow flickering like a dying ember. "For now," she said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "But it's not over. It warned us about the hymn's price, and I don't think we've paid it yet." The cavern was eerily silent, the echoes of the villagers' hymn fading into nothingness. Marta leaned against the chamber wall, her legs weak and her breath labored. The sigil still hung faintly in the air, its glow pulsating weakly as if clinging to life. Around her, the villagers began to recover, their faces pale and their expressions filled with a mixture of relief and dread. The entity was gone, at least for now, but the weight of its final words lingered like a shadow over them. Greta was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "What did it mean by the price? We finished the hymn. We defeated it. Isn't that enough?" Marta shook her head, her eyes fixed on the faintly glowing sigil. "Magic like this doesn't work without consequences. The hymn is ancient, written in blood and sacrifice. It bound the entity once, and it demanded something then. It will demand something now." Elias knelt by one of the shattered monolith fragments, his hands tracing the glowing symbols that had faded into an icy blue. These fragments, they were forged for a reason. Maybe they were meant to hold the price, he murmured. His words offered no comfort, only a chilling reminder that they were still entangled in forces beyond their comprehension. The villagers murmured nervously among themselves, their voices growing louder with each passing moment. Some began to edge toward the chamber's exit, their instincts screaming to flee. "We've done what we came to do," said a burly man near the back, his voice rising above the din. "The entity's gone. Let's leave this cursed place and never come back." But as the first villagers stepped toward the exit, a deep rumble shook the chamber. The sigil flared to life, its glow turning crimson as it expanded, filling the air with an oppressive heat. The villagers froze, their fear palpable as the light seemed to reach for them, wrapping the chamber in its fiery embrace. "No one leaves," a voice boomed, not from the entity, but from the sigil itself. The voice was layered, as if a chorus of ancient souls were speaking in unison. The villagers cowered, their knees buckling under the weight of its authority. Marta stepped forward, her exhaustion forgotten in the face of this new threat. "We sang the hymn," she shouted, her voice defiant. "We did what it asked. We deserve to leave." The sigil's light swirled, forming a vortex at its center. "The hymn demands balance," the voice intoned. "The darkness has been banished, but its binding must be sealed. Blood must be paid." The villagers erupted into chaos, their fear turning to panic. Some cried out in protest, while others clung to one another, their faces pale and their bodies trembling. Marta raised her hands, trying to calm them. "Listen to me," she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. "If we panic, we'll only make it worse. We have to figure out what it wants." The sigil flared again, its voice growing louder. "One life for many, a soul to anchor the binding. Choose, or all will be forfeit." The words hung in the air like a death knell. The villagers fell silent, their eyes darting from one another in desperation. No one dared to speak, but the unspoken question loomed. Who would pay the price? Marta's chest tightened as she realized the weight of the sigil's demand. The villagers had come together to defeat the entity, but now they were being torn apart by the very song that had saved them. She looked at Elias, Greta, and the others, their faces filled with fear and uncertainty. No one was willing to volunteer, yet no one dared defy the sigil's command. Taking a deep breath, Marta stepped forward, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "If it's a life you want," she said, her gaze unwavering, "take mine. I led them here. I'll pay the price." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Elias grabbed her arm, his eyes wide with disbelief. "No, we came here together. This isn't your burden alone." Marta turned to him, her expression resolute. "If I don't do this, the sigil will take all of us. This is the only way." The sigil's vortex slowed, its crimson light dimming slightly, as if considering her offer. The chamber grew quiet once more, the villagers holding their breath as they awaited its judgment. Marta stood tall, her hands trembling, but her resolve unshaken. "Your offer is accepted," the sigil intoned, its voice softer now, almost mournful. The light enveloped Marta, lifting her into the air as the villagers watched in stunned silence. Her body glowed with an otherworldly radiance, and for a moment, she felt a profound peace wash over her. As the light consumed her, Marta's final thought was not of fear, but of hope. She had saved her people. Whatever lay beyond, she would face it with the same defiance that had brought them this far. And then, she was gone. The silence that followed Marta's sacrifice was suffocating, a heavy emptiness that filled the cavern and the hearts of those left behind. The sigil had faded, its crimson light dissolving into the air like the remnants of a dream. For a moment, the villagers simply stood there, their faces etched with disbelief and grief. Marta was gone, her bravery a stark reminder of the stakes they faced. Yet, even with her sacrifice, the tension in the room did not dissipate entirely. Elias was the first to move, dropping to his knees in the center of the chamber. His hands pressed against the cold stone where Marta had stood moments before, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Greta approached him cautiously, her own tears streaming down her face, but she knew they could not linger in despair. "We need to leave," she said, her voice hoarse but firm. "We can't stay here any longer." As if on cue, the cavern groaned, the walls trembling as dust and small rocks fell from the ceiling. The villagers exchanged panicked glances, the realization dawning on them that this place was no longer stable. The ancient forces that had held the entity and the sigil in balance were unraveling, and the consequences were now manifesting in the very structure around them. The group began to move toward the exit, their steps hurried and chaotic. Elias rose reluctantly, his face pale and hollow, and followed the others as the tremors grew more violent. The tunnel that had brought them into the heart of the mountain was now a treacherous path, littered with fallen debris and suffused with a strange, pulsing energy that made the air hum. It was as though the mountain itself was alive, heaving with the aftermath of their battle. As they climbed, a sharp cry rang out from the back of the group. Greta turned to see one of the villagers, a wiry man named Victor, grasping his chest as if in pain. His face contorted, and his eyes glowed faintly red, the same crimson that had marked the sigil. He staggered forward, collapsing to his knees as the villagers recoiled in fear. "What's happening to him?" Greta shouted, rushing to Victor's side despite the other's hesitation. He clawed at the air, his breath coming in shallow gasps, and then, without warning, his body arched violently. A dark mist erupted from his mouth, swirling upward and forming into an ominous shape, a twisted, shifting mass that pulsed with a life of its own. Elias pulled Greta back just as the mist solidified, its shape taking on features that were grotesque and familiar. It was the entity, but diminished, its form unstable and flickering as if it were struggling to maintain its existence. The villagers screamed, their unity fracturing as they scattered in different directions. "Fools!" the entity hissed, its voice fragmented and weaker than before. "You thought the song could destroy me? The hymn merely scattered my essence, but I am bound to this place. As long as the binding remains incomplete, I will persist." Elias stepped forward, his fear overridden by a desperate need for answers. "What do you mean?" "Marta's sacrifice. She gave her life to seal you." The entity's fractured form writhed, its laughter cold and mocking. "Her sacrifice was noble, but insufficient. The hymn requires not just blood, but understanding, a will strong enough to shape the binding, to weave it into the fabric of this cursed place. She lacked that power, and now you all must pay the price." Greta looked at Elias, her face pale but resolute. "The fragments," she whispered urgently. "The monolith pieces, Elias, they weren't just symbols. They were part of the binding. We need to use them." Elias's eyes widened in realization. The fragments, scattered across the chamber, had been imbued with the very magic that held the entity at bay. If they could somehow reassemble the pieces and channel the hymn's power through them, perhaps they could finish what Marta had started. But the entity was not idle. It lashed out with tendrils of shadow, driving the villagers into a frenzy of fear. Greta grabbed Elias's arm, pulling him toward the fragments as chaos erupted around them. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice urgent. "We have to act now, or Marta's sacrifice will mean nothing." As the walls of the mountain shook and the entity's presence grew more menacing, Elias and Greta gathered the fragments, their hands trembling but determined. The others began to rally around them, their fear giving way to a fragile hope. Together, they would have to complete the binding, or face the unthinkable consequences. The realization that the fragments of the monolith were key to sealing the entity's power was both a beacon of hope and a crushing burden. As Elias and Greta worked quickly to gather the pieces, the ground trembled beneath their feet, and the walls of the cavern continued to groan in protest. Time, it seemed, was running out. Every passing second brought them closer to the entity's full return, and the sound of its distorted laughter reverberated through the tunnels, a constant reminder of the terror they faced. Greta's hands shook as she placed the first fragment on the ground. The piece, which had once held only symbolic meaning, now felt heavy with the weight of its purpose. Elias knelt beside her, positioning the next fragment in a precise alignment. "We have to match the pattern," he said, his voice steady despite the rising panic. "If we can align them correctly, the magic will flow." Just like before, he was unsure of the specifics of the magic, but he had to trust that the fragments had once been part of a greater whole, and that in reuniting them, they could restore the balance. Each piece held a part of the song, a note that had been shattered when the sigil collapsed. The hymn, in its fragmented form, had already done its work on Marta's sacrifice, but it needed to be completed. Without the final harmony, the entity would rise again, more powerful, more malicious than ever before. As the pieces came together, a soft glow began to emanate from their edges. The energy pulsed in time with the entity's frantic thrashing, and for a moment, Elias believed they had failed. The air thickened, and the shadows surrounding them deepened as if they were being swallowed whole. But then, as the last fragment clicked into place, the glow intensified, filling the cavern with a brilliant light that temporarily blinded them. The sound of the hymn, faint but recognizable, filled the air. It was the same song that had echoed through the village that fateful night, now amplified by the energy of the monolith's fragments. Elias could feel the magic coursing through him, his heart racing as the familiar yet strange power settled into his bones. The walls of the cavern vibrated with the song, and the entity let out an agonized howl. "This is it," Greta whispered, her voice strained as the magic around them swirled violently. "We have to hold it?" The air became thick with a strange tension. The entity, now fully aware of what they were attempting, gathered its power for one final assault. Dark tendrils of shadow lashed out, striking the fragments, attempting to tear them apart. The cavern quaked as the entity's power surged, but the fragments held strong, their glow brightening to an almost blinding intensity. "Focus," Elias muttered to himself, his mind spinning. He remembered the instructions Marta had whispered to him before her death. The final words of the hymn, the keys to weaving the magic together. Closing his eyes, he let the song fill his mind, every note sinking into his consciousness. His hands, trembling, reached out toward the fragments, and he began to hum. The melody was imperfect at first, hesitant, as though the song itself had forgotten how to harmonize. But as Elias's voice grew louder, the energy surrounding the fragments responded, drawing strength from the song. Greta joined in, her voice a steady counterpoint to Elias's. Together, they wove the final notes of the hymn, the last pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The entity, sensing the shift in the balance, screamed in fury, its form distorting in an attempt to resist. But it was too late. The magic had taken root, and as the final chord of the hymn resonated through the cavern, the force that held the entity at bay snapped into place. The entity's form shattered, its darkness dissipating like smoke on the wind. For a moment, there was only silence. The tremors stopped, and the cavern stilled. The air felt lighter, less oppressive. Elias and Greta stood in the center of the chamber, their hands still trembling, but their hearts lighter. The fragments had done their work, completing the binding that had begun long ago. But just as they thought the battle was over, the ground beneath them rumbled again, this time with a strange, unsettling rhythm. The entity was not gone. It had merely retreated, forced into the deepest corners of the mountain, waiting, patient. Elias could feel its presence lingering, the weight of its malevolence hanging in the air. "We've only delayed it," Greta said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not over. It will never be over." Elias nodded, his thoughts racing. The entity had been contained, but the price of its return would always be present. The village was safe, for now, but the darkness would never fully be banished. There would always be another cycle, another threat, another moment when the hymn would have to be sung again. As they made their way back to the surface, the weight of what they had done settled over them. The village was saved, but at what cost? The shadows of the past would continue to haunt them, and the song that had once brought so much hope would now be a constant reminder of the darkness they had faced, and the darkness yet to come. The weeks following the entity's apparent defeat were marked by a strange calm that settled over the village. It was a peace that felt unnatural, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. The inhabitants, while relieved, found it difficult to shake the sense of unease that clung to them. The once vibrant town, now stripped of the excitement and bustle it had once enjoyed, felt like a hollow shell of its former self. The land was quiet, the air still, and no one dared speak of what had happened in the depths of the church. The villagers clung to their routines, attempting to ignore the creeping knowledge that something was waiting just beyond the veil of their perception. Elias and Greta, now regarded as the saviors of the town, found themselves caught between gratitude and suspicion. Their actions in the cavern had saved countless lives, Yet a part of them felt no triumph in the aftermath. Their journey had begun with a desire to protect their home, but it had led them into a darker understanding of the world around them. One that, no matter how much they wished to forget, was now a permanent part of their reality. Elias often wandered through the town late at night, unable to shake the feeling that the entity was not truly gone. His nights were filled with fragmented dreams, dark, shapeless figures shifting in the corners of his vision, whispers that beckoned him from the shadows. There were moments when he thought he could hear the song again, faint and distant, like the echo of a memory just out of reach. It was a sound that both comforted and terrified him, and in those fleeting moments, he wondered if the entity was still out there, waiting to return. Greta, on the other hand, tried to move forward. She focused on rebuilding the village, helping to restore the church, and reassuring the villagers that the worst was behind them. But even she could not escape the lingering questions. Every crack in the foundation, every dark corner of the church seemed to whisper a warning. The monolith fragments that had been used to seal the entity's power now sat in the church's crypt, encased in a protective circle, but it was as though they carried an ominous weight. The magic, now dormant, pulsed like a forgotten heartbeat, reminding them both that the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the unseen had been irreversibly altered. One evening, while Elias stood alone at the edge of the village, watching the sun sink beneath the mountains, he felt the ground shift underfoot. It was subtle at first, like the rumble of distant thunder, but the sensation grew more pronounced with each passing second. His heart raced as he realized that the earth itself was trembling. But this tremor was different from the quakes he had felt during the battle with the entity. It was quieter, more insidious, like a whisper from the very bones of the world. Something was stirring beneath the surface. Without thinking, Elias turned and ran toward the church, his mind racing with thoughts of the fragments. He knew that the entity had not been truly vanquished, that it had simply retreated, waiting for the right moment to strike. But as he reached the church, the tremors stopped, leaving only an unsettling silence in their wake. The town was still. The only sound was the distant murmur of the river, flowing gently through the valley. Greta met him at the church door, her face pale with concern. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "I felt something," Elias replied, his voice low. "I don't think it's over. The tremors, they were different this time. I think it's still here, beneath us." Greta hesitated before nodding. "We've been waiting for this, haven't we?" she said, her voice grim. "The entity's power hasn't been destroyed. It's just been buried." The truth of her words hung heavy in the air. They had done everything they could, used every fragment of magic at their disposal, and yet the entity was still there, lurking in the shadows. Their victory had been a temporary one, a mere pause in a far longer and more dangerous battle. The two of them spent the night in the church, watching over the crypt where the fragments were stored. The silence between them was oppressive, filled with the unspoken acknowledgement that the world they had once known had been irreparably changed. Every creak of wood, every whisper of wind, felt like an omen. The entity was out there, waiting for its moment to return. As dawn broke over the mountains, Elias and Greta made a decision. They could no longer wait for the inevitable to find them. They needed to confront the truth, to seek out the source of the disturbances, no matter the cost. They gathered their belongings, preparing for what they knew would be a dangerous journey, one that would take them to places they had long since abandoned in their minds, places where the lines between the physical and the supernatural were no longer distinct. And as they set out, the faintest sound reached their ears, a low hum, like a distant voice, calling to them from the depths of the earth. It was the same song that had once echoed through the church, the hymn that had started it all, and now it seemed the song was not finished. The entity was waiting for them to complete it. Elias looked at Greta, his expression a mixture of determination and fear. "We have to finish it," he said quietly. Greta nodded, her eyes resolute. "This time we do it right. We can't let it escape again." Together, they ventured into the unknown, knowing that whatever lay ahead, it was something they could never escape. The echoes of the entity were now part of their lives, and they would face whatever came next because, for better or worse, they had become its keepers. The journey that Elias and Greta embarked upon was unlike anything they had ever experienced. The landscape around the village had changed dramatically in the aftermath of the entity's initial disappearance. The vibrant trees that once lined the paths leading to the church had grown twisted and barren. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. Every step they took seemed to disturb the ground beneath them, as though the very earth was aware of their presence. The village, now far behind them, was a memory, a distant reminder of the life they had once known. As they ventured deeper into the wilderness, the distance between themselves and the safety of the town grew wider. The woods, once welcoming and familiar, now seemed to take on a menacing quality. Shadows moved unnaturally in the corners of their vision, and the air felt charged with a strange energy. Every so often, Elias would catch a glimpse of something fleeting, just out of reach, but unmistakably real. It was as though the very landscape was haunted by the specter of the entity, an unseen presence that could not be ignored. The night came quickly, as it always did in the mountains. The fading light of the sun cast long shadows across the forest floor, and the sound of the river grew distant, as if even it were retreating from the encroaching darkness. Greta lit a fire, her hands shaking slightly as she worked to keep the flame steady. They had no intention of resting for long, but they needed to prepare themselves for whatever lay ahead. The weight of their mission pressed heavily on both of them. "We're getting closer," Elias murmured, gazing into the growing darkness. His voice was tight with anxiety, but there was an undercurrent of determination. "I can feel it." Greta did not reply immediately. She knew what he meant. It wasn't just the landscape that had changed. It was something in the air, something intangible. The presence of the entity had been a constant undercurrent to their lives, a hum that resonated deep within their bones. And now it was growing stronger. They were approaching the place where the song had begun, where it had first entered their lives. The very source of the entity's power. The fire crackled and popped as they sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The stars above them seemed to shimmer unnaturally, flickering in and out of view, as though they too were part of the entity's influence. The hum of the song was faint, but undeniable. It was still there, lingering just beneath the surface of their consciousness. It had not disappeared. Instead, it had woven itself into the very fabric of the world around them. Without warning, the sound grew louder. It was subtle at first, but soon it became undeniable. The song, the haunting melody they had both heard in their dreams, the one that had started everything, was playing once more. It was distant but distinct, as if coming from deep within the earth, rising up from the very core of the mountain they were approaching. The haunting, melodic tune wrapped around them like a cold, invisible hand, pulling them forward, urging them onward. "This is it," Elias whispered, his voice strained. "It's calling us?" Greta, her face pale and drawn, nodded. She had known this would happen, but now that it was real, it was harder to face than she had anticipated. The entity was not dead. It was merely biding its time, waiting for the right moment to return. And now, that moment had arrived. They stood up, leaving the fire to burn down to embers. Together, they walked toward the source of the sound, their hearts pounding in unison. The world around them seemed to shift, the landscape changing with each step they took. The trees grew denser, their branches twisting together in unnatural patterns, blocking out the sky. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that they could see their breath fogging in front of them. Finally, they reached the clearing where the song seemed to originate. It was an ancient stone structure, half hidden by overgrowth and decay. It looked like a forgotten monument, its purpose long since lost to time. The stones were etched with strange symbols, half eroded by the elements, but still legible to those who knew where to look. Elias ran his fingers over one of the symbols, feeling the familiar pulse of magic beneath his touch. This was it. This was the place where the entity had first been summoned. As they stepped closer, the song grew louder, filling their minds with its eerie melody. The air around them seemed to hum with power, and Elias felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble once again, as though the very earth was waking from a long slumber. The entity was here. It had never truly left. A dark figure appeared in the center of the structure, slowly emerging from the shadows. It was a silhouette at first, but as it came into full view, it took on the shape of a tall, indistinct figure, its features shrouded in darkness. The song, now deafening in its intensity, seemed to emanate from the figure itself. Greta stepped forward, her voice steady despite the terror she felt. "We've come to stop this," she said, her words cutting through the music like a knife. "This ends tonight." The figure turned its head slowly, and Elias could feel the weight of its gaze, though he could not see its eyes. It was as though the very air had thickened, pressing down on them, suffocating them with its presence. The entity's form shimmered, as if it were both there and not there, shifting between reality and some other plane of existence. For a long moment, the song seemed to pause. The figure regarded them with an unsettling silence, and Elias felt his heart pounding in his chest. This was no longer just a battle of strength. It was a battle of wills, a contest for control over something far greater than either of them. And then, the song began again, louder, more insistent. It was a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling their minds with visions of an ancient world, of a time when the boundaries between the living and the dead were not so clearly defined. The entity's power was immense, but they had come too far to turn back now. "This time we finish it," Elias said, his voice filled with resolve. The final chapter was being written, and neither of them would let it end in darkness. The song surged once more, but now so did their resolve. They had come to break the cycle, to end the haunting melody once and for all. And in that moment, they realized the true meaning of their journey. It wasn't just about defeating the entity. It was about freeing themselves from the song's unending echo. The time for silence was now. The last confrontation with the entity had altered everything. The once immense presence that had loomed over the village, casting shadows over every corner of their lives, was now silent. Elias and Greta stood in the ruins of the ancient stone structure, their bodies exhausted, but their spirits unbroken. The melody that had haunted their thoughts, the sound that had filled the very air they breathed, had ceased. The world around them had grown still, almost unnervingly so. The hum of the universe, which they had once been so attuned to, was gone. It was difficult for either of them to say exactly what had happened in those final moments, where the song had reached its crescendo and everything had fallen silent. One moment, the entity's presence had been undeniable, wrapping around them like a cold wind, pushing and pulling at their very essence. The next, it had vanished, not in a dramatic explosion of light or shadow, but in the way an echo fades, slowly and imperceptibly, until nothing remains but the lingering emptiness. Elias had stood, his hands trembling, his mind swimming with the weight of everything that had led them to that moment. Greta, her face pale, had been similarly shaken, yet there was a resoluteness in her posture that had anchored them both. They had known, deep down, that they had crossed the threshold. The entity's power was broken, not because they had destroyed it, but because they had denied it what it had wanted most: control. The song had been its instrument, a force that could only exist in the minds and hearts of those who succumbed to its rhythm. By resisting, by choosing silence, they had ended its reign. In the moments that followed, the air itself had shifted. The forest, once thick with an unnatural fog, had begun to clear. The cold that had seeped into their bones lifted, replaced by a warmth that seemed to hum with life. The trees, which had stood crooked and barren for so long, were beginning to straighten, their leaves slowly unfurling as though they had been reborn. The world around them was healing, slowly but surely, in the wake of the entity's departure. They had returned to the village, though the journey felt different now. The streets were eerily quiet, as though the residents, too, were feeling the aftermath of the events that had transpired. But as they walked through the town, Elias and Greta noticed something subtle but profound. The buildings, the homes, the familiar landmarks, they all seemed the same, yet there was a difference. There was a new light in the air, an energy that had been missing before. It was as though the village had been freed from a curse it hadn't even known it was under. They found the church at the heart of the village, the place where it had all started. The doors, which had once been closed off and locked with an otherworldly force, were now open. A soft breeze drifted through the open doors, carrying with it the scent of fresh earth and new beginnings. Elias and Greta stood at the threshold, looking inside. The pews, the altar, the stained glass windows. They all seemed unchanged, yet everything about the place felt different. The song that had once resonated within these walls was gone. There was only silence, profound and peaceful. "What happens now?" Greta asked quietly, breaking the stillness between them. Her voice seemed almost foreign in the calm, a reminder of the chaos they had left behind. Elias took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the altar. "We live, we rebuild, we move forward." The words were simple, but in their simplicity, they carried the weight of everything they had experienced. They had been through a journey that had tested them in ways they could never have anticipated. They had faced the darkest corners of the world, and in doing so, they had found something unexpected within themselves. The strength to resist, to stand firm in the face of an unrelenting force. The silence that followed was not an absence of sound, but a presence in itself, a presence that allowed them to finally breathe freely. It was a silence that had been earned, not through battle or destruction, but through the understanding that some things could not be fought, only understood and transcended. The song, the entity, the darkness that had once overshadowed their lives. None of it had been an enemy to be vanquished, but a challenge to be overcome. As they sat together on the steps of the church, gazing out at the village and the mountains beyond, they could see the subtle signs of change. The air felt lighter, the sky clearer, and the world, in all its complexity, seemed to be slowly healing. They had broken the cycle of fear that had ruled their lives. But more than that, they had embraced a truth. That true power lay not in the external world, but in their ability to confront the unknown within themselves. Greta reached out, placing her hand on Elias's, a gesture that spoke volumes without the need for words. It was a symbol of solidarity, of shared strength and understanding. They had walked through darkness together, and now they were walking toward the light. For the first time since the entity's return, Elias felt the weight in his chest ease. He had spent so many nights in fear, unsure of what would come next, unable to escape the haunting song that had wrapped itself around his mind. But now, there was only peace. The silence was not just the absence of sound. It was a presence of clarity, of calm. They had not defeated the entity by force, but by reclaiming their own agency, by choosing not to be controlled by it. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting a golden glow over the village, Elias and Greta knew that their journey had come to an end. The world had been forever changed by their actions, but it was not a change brought about by violence or vengeance. It was a change forged through understanding, through the recognition that even in the most oppressive forces, there is the potential for peace. They had chosen silence, and in doing so, they had found the freedom they had long sought.